So in just a few weeks, the U.S. will be marking the 17th anniversary of the 9/11 attacks. We've been a nation at war ever since. Nearly 17 years in Afghanistan, more than 15 years in Iraq. In that time, as C.J. Chivers notes in his new book, more than 2.7 million Americans have served in Afghanistan or Iraq, and many have fought in both wars. Nearly 7,000 of them have died, and tens of thousands more were wounded. In The Fighters, Chris tells the story of these ongoing, ill-fated, grossly mismanaged, and terribly costly conflicts. He tells the story not from the vantage of generals and admirals and civilian policymakers, but from the perspectives of those who've done the bulk of the fighting, the grunts, as they call themselves, in the lower and middle ranks. Chris focuses on 6 individuals, but each belongs to a different military service, and their tours occurred at different times and in different places. The idea is that these individuals represent the experiences of, as Chris puts it, a significant portion of those who fought. Chris is particularly well qualified to present this intense, compelling, and unsettling account of Americans at war. He served in the Marines during the Persian Gulf War, and for nearly 20 years now, he's been a journalist with the New York Times. If you're familiar with his reporting, you'll know he writes about military affairs with the authority and informed eye for detail of a veteran and with the clarity and punch of a talented wordsmith. Much of Chris's reporting for the Times has occurred overseas as a correspondent in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Israel, the Palestinian territories, Libya, Russia, and elsewhere on a wide range of assignments. Nowadays, he writes for the New York Times Magazine and the newspaper's investigations desk. His stories have been part of 2 team Pulitzers awarded to the Times in 2002 for public service and in 2009 for international reporting. Last year, Chris received the Pulitzer for feature writing for a Times Magazine story that led to the release from an Illinois prison of an Afghan war veteran suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. He's also the author of a previous book, The Gun, a history published 8 years ago of automatic weapons and the consequences of their mass distribution seen through the development of the AK-47. A review of The Fighters in the Wall Street Journal said the book provides, quote, a dark and honest reckoning, end quote, of U.S. military involvement in Afghanistan and Iraq since the 9/11 attacks. And a New York Times review called The Fighters, quote, a classic of war reporting, saying, quote, it could be the most powerful indictment yet of America's recent Middle East wars. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Chris Chivers.
I'm looking for a few friends. I see them. There are people in this room who are in this book. I'm not going to embarrass them now with introductions. After this talk, I think we'll all go over to Comet Ping Pong Pizza, which I guess is right around the corner. I'll be here for a bit after for anyone who wants to stay. But if you want to talk one-on-one, we can do it there later because we don't want to stay here all night. So now I'll stay as late as you'd like there. I'm going to say a few remarks, only a few. I'm going to read a few paragraphs, only a few. I have trouble reading the book. I had a lot of trouble writing it. I have trouble reading it out loud. When I was going through the editing process and the line editing process, one thing a lot of writers do is we read our passages aloud to untangle syntax, to find the right rhythm where the wrong rhythm exists, and to try to improve the prose. And I did that, and I had to stop in my house because my family couldn't take it. The book's pretty raw. So I will read a few paragraphs from some of the milder sections, and then I'll take questions. This, I think, is my 4th talk, At every one of them, people with personal connections to the book have shown up. People who have deep personal connections to the wars have shown up. So we have a lot to talk about. So you'll probably find your participation, the Q&A, is more interesting than what I have here in my pad. But I have to do it, I guess, sort of as an act of throat clearing and a declaration of point of view, because the book's written with a point of view. The history of wars, in my view, have too much general and not enough sergeant. The book we're discussing tonight is about sergeants and people near sergeants, the warrant officers, specialists, privates, first class, lieutenants, and the like, who actually fight America's wars. And it covers them with a very simple idea, that they're human, and that their human experiences, what they did and what they suffered, can help us understand wars that have been waged for more than 15 years with no clear end in sight. Those of you who know me know my position on the wars. For those of you who don't know me, I'll be full-throated and clear. I'm a skeptic. The wars, in my view, have achieved almost nothing like what their organizers promised, no matter the party in power or the commanding general of the moment. In one area after another, they failed by their own measures. We'll just list a few. Reduction of terrorism. The Islamic State is a consequence of the invasion of Iraq. Protection of populations. We can argue about numbers, but the conservative estimates are hundreds of thousands of civilians killed. Development of Afghan and Iraqi security forces. They stand now at a fraction of those we issued weapons to and put in uniforms. Replacement of opium poppy with alternative crops. Afghanistan has produced more poppy in most of the years of occupation than it did before we arrived. I can go on, but I'll stop the big picture talk now. I just thought it was important that you hear my indelibly skeptical views so you understand the book you're about to read as sort of an act of public honesty. I'm not going to sit here and be wishy-washy about what I think. But I'll stop there because this work in the book that I hope you'll read is about people. And to me, that work about people is urgent and it's necessary because the country is separate from its fighting class. There's reasons for this. With the end of conscription came the end of our population's connection to those it sends to fight. You gave the statistics already. Something like 1%, less than 1% of the country has shown up for these wars. Much of that 1% showed up for both of the wars. That's obviously not all of the population that's immediately affected. We can expand that percentage out to include immediate family, and perhaps we reach 10%. I'm not going to do the demography, but the proportion is very small. If we expand those numbers and include the family, this country has had almost no familial stake in these wars. And for many of the families, they only had it for a few years, not the entire 16 or 17 or whatever our tally is now. The people who fight for us are not known to us. This book tries to remedy some of that, with the idea that if you understand the people, maybe you'll take an interest in the war, and maybe we can have a fuller discussion about the wars and where they're headed and why and what they are or are not achieving and what might be done differently. People ask me, and maybe one of you will, so I'm going to preempt you with your question. What do I think we should do? My only answer to that is I do description, not prescription. I don't pretend to know. There are many better minds than mine on these questions. I'm not a strategist or a policy setter or even a policy recommender. The only thing I recommend is a fuller discussion about what we're doing, and that the national hive mind, if you want to call it that, might become engaged and have a better course than we have now. I'm going to read a little, a brief section. The book, as I mentioned, is very graphic and raw in places. I felt it was necessary for it to be, for you to understand some of what the characters experience. And I'm not able to read much of it aloud, so I won't try, but I am going to read a section about the burdens of doubt and moral freight that people can carry after participation in combat. The context for this is it's a Navy corpsman. Most of you probably know what a corpsman is, but think medic. It's the Navy's version of an Army medic, and the corpsmen provide trauma care to Marines. And this corpsman had just saved his former roommate's life. He'd been shot through the head. And it's about the doubts that attended him almost instantly. The Marines loaded Smith onto a poleless litter, lifted him, and rushed to the aircraft. It was a Huey gunship, not a medevac bird. Smith was still breathing when they laid him inside. Kirby's job was done. He had to hand over his friend. Over the roar of the engine, he shouted life-saving steps to the door gunner, tapped Smith on the leg, and ran clear. The blade swept up dust and grass and blew the red smoke away, scattering it in pink wisps. The helicopter moved low over the field, gaining elevation, cleared a date palm grove, and was gone. Suddenly there was nothing for Kirby to do. He ran back to his truck and plopped into the right front seat. The company began moving. Someone said a car had sped away after the shot, heading to a house that weapons company would now search. Kirby sat in the front seat, his hands and arms and legs wet with his friend's blood. It was clotting, sticky, and still warm. He held Smith's helmet. He turned it over to look at where the bullet passed through. The bullet rolled inside. It was an armor-piercing 7.62 by 5.4 round. It had zipped through the front of the helmet and then the top of Smith's head. Kirby lifted it out and inspected it, rolling it in his hand. It kept its shape. He put it in his pocket. Nausea came in waves. Outside, weapons company's Marines were rushing to the house where they had heard the sniper might have hidden. They detained 2 men. Kirby had not been ordered out. He stayed in his seat, listening to the radio reports, waiting to be called, trembling with an energy that he could neither channel nor contain. Tears streamed down his face. He stared at his bloody hands and at the stains on his legs and lap where he had cradled Smith's head. He shook uncontrollably. He rocked back and forth in the seat. Never before had he saved a life. He had thought it would be cool. Instead, he felt guilty. He had seen the entrance and exit wounds and the torn brain matter and had a sense of what was missing. Some of it was inside the helmet on his lap. Kirby could visualize the path of the steel bullet through his friend's skull. If Smith survived the trip to the first hospital, if he made it through stabilization and surgery and the transfer to Germany, what kind of life could he expect? Kirby had acted in the moment, holding emotions in check so he could do his job. Now his emotions broke free. He had a chance to think past the second-by-second sequence and the tasks of life-saving steps. He was not sure what saving a life meant. Did I do that for me? Kirby wondered. Or for him? He did not know whether Smith was even still alive. There was no medic on the Huey. He might die on the way. Kirby had done what he had most wanted to do and was trying not to vomit. I'll jump ahead and say Smith survived, and he's still alive, and Doc, Kirby, and Colin Smith remain friends, and that for about a week or more, I'd have to go and check my notes, probably it's in the book, I could check there, Kirby was basically an insomniac, walking almost like, if you can imagine, zombie fashion, unsure, waiting for word of Smith and how his, neurology was faring. And there came a moment later in the book where he gets a phone call from Smith's father, who says to him basically, as long as I'm alive, you'll always have a father in Ohio. So that's the outcome of that scene. Brad asked me to talk a little bit about process, and that scene provides an opportunity for that. A lot of the book serves as an anti-memoir. I'm not in it, except for the preface, where you can hear words like what I opened with here. But in many of the scenes I was present, including that one. That played out right next to me. But I found being present's never enough. What you see and what you hear, or what you think you see and what you think you hear, usually aren't enough to make a coherent, sturdy account. And so what followed for years, over the last 6 years or so, was I was going back to each of these characters, those who remain alive, and trying to download their brains. Some of them are, I don't think we have any of the primary characters in the room, but we have people in the room who are secondary characters or sources, and they'll tell you I'm kind of a pain in the ass. And there are many, many long nights where we would be talking, and I would just be taking notes, hours of notes at a time. And then once I thought I had downloaded each person's brain at the same incident until I could make a more coherent account of it, I would then make a map of people around them, a social map, their family members, their friends, others who might not have been at the scene but were later connected to it, perhaps those who gave them medical care, or like Matt's in the back of the room, he picked up one of the characters in a Black Hawk helicopter on a long flight, one of four pilots, two aircrafts that went to go get a fellow pilot who'd been shot. And then after I would get a draft of a chapter together, I would warn the characters that we are now going to start the real work, fact-checking. Because you can't write a draft without having errors in it. It's impossible, particularly if you have multiple people's accounts. Some facts are easy to check. Many of the characters gave me their email records or their journals or their diaries, or, not going to name names, records they'd taken with them when they left their commands or military service. So I had official records. I had, PowerPoint presentations, or what they call storyboards. I had diaries. Those are easy to check because you have them. But many other things are difficult. And so working with a fact checker, we went back through every passage with the characters and the secondary characters. That's why it took so long. If my publisher is watching, they know I'm 3 years late with this book. People would say, when's your deadline? And I'd say, oh, today's my deadline. Every day is my deadline. My deadline was 2 years ago or a year ago. But we finally finished what turned out to be a pretty immersive process, but one in which I think by the time we published, all the people who were in the book know that they participated in it fully, and that, we would say we need to make it. And I don't know if we achieved it, and if we didn't, it's my fault, but we would say, we got to make it so you can hit any paragraph with a hammer and not a word will move. So, who wants to ask questions? You guys want to talk? Or you want to go get pizza?
Hi, just to say, not only are you a fantastic reporter and writer, but my family is grateful to you for mentoring Brian Denton, my nephew and godson, who came out as a small, young photographer and learned so much from you. Can you talk a little bit about how you manage risk, about how you decide where you're going to go to see these scenes that you've captured?
So the question, do you guys all hear it? Because I can never, again, with my hearing aids, I can never tell what I'm hearing and what I'm not, what I'm missing. So the question's about risk management. So
Thank you.
Risk mitigation really is about self-management. One of the weaknesses that journalists have is who do this kind of work is they tend to be excitable, or worse, excitable and competitive. And so people often will get into circumstances very hastily that they shouldn't be in. And so, like when I was first working with Brian, which was like 7 or 8 years ago, and Brian had some experience. He was not like absolutely a boot or a neophyte. He'd worked in Afghanistan a little already, and he'd worked the beginnings of the Arab Spring. Brian also has good sense, really good sense, which makes it much easier to work with someone when they have good sense. But I would, say to Brian, and we kind of had a reputation for going pretty far forward regularly, have a reason for everything you do. Taking risks is fine, but it needs to be attached to gain, journalistic gain. We're not here for the ride. We're here for the readers. So anything we take on should have a purpose in the research that can inform what you're later going to give to readers, or in Brian's cases, we'll call them, those who look at his photography, viewers. And that was something that, we tried to apply to every morning when we went out. And then there's like a methodology. Like when I was in the military, there's so-called intelligence that tells you where to go and not to go. But the real intelligence mostly is the gut instincts of NCOs, experienced Marines, who are out there. And so you try to develop a gut and ask yourself why you're doing what you're doing, and I would often tell new people when I worked with them, you may get shot today. Are you okay with that? Do you have a story reason to get shot? Because when you're laying there shot and people have to run out and get you, were you doing it for journalism or were you doing it for the ride? When you're laying there shot or hit with shrapnel, you better be able to articulate a journalistic reason for that last step you took before you got hit. And so I would basically try to build breaks into people's heads so that they would process that into all of their thinking. And even if you do that, it's still just a blood lottery. You can do everything right and things can still go terribly for you. Did I answer your question?
Yes.
Yeah.
Hi. If you were given 4 options as to why we went into the Middle East just prior to the intervention in Iraq specifically, and I said, was it ideological? Was it militarily a means of redefining the force structure and the giving a sense of mission to the military, or the weapons of mass destruction? Among these, which one do you think held credibility, and it could be any one, a combination of them, but I was interested in your specific take on what you think were the main reasons.
So I have to say, my lenses look lower. I'm not able to answer your question. I haven't tried to download the brains of the people at the top. I have a almost crippling allergy to authority. So I'm not going to be a person who's ever going to take that role on, or if I did, I wouldn't succeed at it. So I don't know.
Okay.
I don't know. I live to try to understand and write about the people who are stuck in the policy, not the people who make it. I'm sorry.
You may not answer this one either, but it seems like this is an age-old, universal, from my perspective, problem, that there's a disconnect between the policymakers and the people who actually have to do the grunt work and get out there and do that. And over the course of history, particularly our history, but almost human history, there's sort of a tendency to take advantage of youth, so to speak. Their sense of wanting manhood, their sense of glory, often financial situations. And I guess what I'm trying to get at, which again you might not feel comfortable with, is if this is a species problem, if this is a problem that's been, and I'm not saying there isn't a good reason to fight some wars and use force and things of that nature, but how is humanity going to step forward and take a greater responsibility from the top for the level of violence we place our youth in, because they're almost, and I use this not in a derogatory way, but they're almost suckered into getting into these horrible situations.
So you're right, I'm not going to be able to give you much of an answer.
Yeah.
I mean, I'll take a stab at the edge of it. Like, yeah, some of it's that the Kool-Aid's really sweet, and people are really thirsty for it. So yeah, there are people who are inclined to war, and they're often the ones who go fight, the ones who volunteer for the infantry, whether the war is wise and just or not. And most societies that I pass through have people, young people like this. You called it humanity, so is it wired into us? Probably. So I look for what would be the steps of mitigation. And, one of my own, the kaleidoscope of Kool-Aid that spins around between all of our eyes when we were young Marines. When I joined the Marine Corps in the 80s, I signed up after the Beirut bombing. That influenced me. That was 1983, and I was a freshman in college, and the attack on the Marines, which killed 241 Marines and sailors, I think I have the number right, that drew me to the Marine Corps. I won't call it an attraction, but it drew me in. And a few years later, I was in the Corps, in the infantry, and the Kool-Aid that we were drinking was about how great we were, because we were an all-volunteer force. We were trained, many people in this room who served back then or before, were trained by draftees, not across the board. Even in the conscription military, you had many volunteers. But there were a lot of draftees who stuck around, and when I was in the 80s, they were still around. And they told me, two things about why the Marine Corps was so much better then. One was all the young people had volunteered. It was a lot easier to lead someone who asked to be there. And the other was they had the drugs under control. People weren't all stoned anymore, as they had been for a number of years. And I believed all of this. I thought, wow, the Marine Corps, right now is sort of peak Marine Corps, right? It's got all this experience from Vietnam. It's got all of these volunteers, and they fed us this line about how great we were. And, this really intense can-do attitude. A can-do attitude is also a curse. It's not really good to have a can-do attitude when you're applied to impossible tasks. I've come over, I guess it's about 30 years now or more, to look at it much differently. I lament that we don't have a draft because of this disconnect that exists. So these people who you say they're in humanity, these people who are inclined to go to war, we don't have brakes really on sending them anymore, because if we hook the country up to a mail lottery where everybody who has a child or a grandchild has to wonder if their household will have to provide a son or daughter for war, the citizens would be paying attention, right? People would be asking questions like, why, to answer your question, why are we in Iraq? Well, we probably would have sorted that out to a larger degree if more than 1% of the population was affected by it directly. I didn't answer your question. I gave you a rambling set of answers.
No, actually you did. I just wanted to say, as far as the draft goes, some people have foot spurs where they're unable to serve even in a draft.
True, but that's true of both parties.
I heard your appearance on WMAU this morning, and you made the terrific analogy between the soldier and the civilian population as being similar to the students and a school superintendent. You want to go further with that?
Oh, okay. No, that wasn't the soldier and the civilian pipe. That's so people, the disconnect between the senior officer class, the generals.
Within the military. Okay.
Within the military. People think the generals speak for the military or for the young military members. They certainly try to, but in my experience, they don't. A general is my age, in his or her 50s, and they have no more real connection to the troops in terms of generationally, what they've been raised in, what they've experienced, than, say, a high school senior does to a school district superintendent. They're that far apart in age. And, we see this all the time. The military is basically a hierarchical organization run by age. How many years in you have determines what station you're likely to occupy in the chain of command. And the people at the top have a lot of military experience, but often don't have nearly as much life experience as those younger. We saw this with like the Marines United scandal, where it really looked like the generals didn't even know what Facebook was, right? I mean, it did. Not across the board, but many of them. And that's that same generational thing. I'm not I have 5 kids, and the oldest is 18, and I know next to nothing about that guy's life. Even though it's playing out right in front of me, I can't. I mean, it's just we're from different times. So that was the analogy I was talking about. Who's next?
Recognize some of the characters in the book from your previous writing, and was wondering if you could talk about the process or the decision to write a book. Was it something that you had previous to meeting these individuals, or something you felt needed to be done after interacting with them?
So it was after. So let me back your question up, though, to talk about character selection. So I selected 6 primary characters, but you could really say it's 7. There's a pair of cousins in there, or you could add 8 because there's a mom who is the protagonist of the last chapter. So 6, 7, 8 characters. I chose them to operate kind of like an ensemble. Each one's playing a different instrument, if you will, to make together something more complete. So they're from different phases and places and times in the war. They're from different doctrines or periods of doctrinal organization in the wars. They have different periods of equipment, different enemies. The enemies changed. I mean, if you could compare the intelligence threats that, a Marine in 2003 had to, say, a soldier in 2006, they're completely different foes that they were fighting. And then I wanted, within that, different, what they call MOSs in the Marine Corps, different jobs. So you've got the rotary wing pilot, you've got a strike fighter pilot. I wanted to show how fighter pilots' careers had changed, because these pilots mostly show up thinking they're going to dogfight, and almost all of them across the period of my life have been in exactly 0 dogfights, and they're involved in, they're essentially attack aircraft now, in the role that we've used them, air-to-ground warfare. I chose people who were career service members who had joined during the Cold War period, and then people who were compelled into the military after the 2001 attacks in Washington and New York. And so together I created a mix. From that, I did choose a couple of characters who I already knew pretty well, because I thought their stories were interesting and I wanted to follow them across time. In the case of Doc Kirby, who's probably the one who I read from here, who you might be referring to, his mother really chewed me out one night. She was harsh. Gail's an amazing woman, and the people who have a chance surviving war or the afterwar period when they come home usually have someone like Gail in their life. And Gail said, you're a real hotshot going and doing all this stuff that you do. Yeah, it looks really cool. It's full of adrenaline. I hope it works for you. And she said, and you're missing the whole story. The adrenaline ends. They come home. They're not in their units anymore. And that's when the real shit starts. And you don't know anything about it. And she was not exactly right. And she'll be listening, and she'd back that up. But she was almost exactly right. I knew very little bit about that. And it didn't really hit me until I stopped going out and came home and suddenly felt completely maladjusted for civilian life. I had this remarks I wrote in a bar called Dubliners about 15 minutes before I showed up, when I was with Matt, the pilot, in the back. Matt, can I tell her what you said? Matt was talking about his own adjustment, more than 2,000 hours flying Black Hawks in Afghanistan and Iraq. And he said, I came home, I went from like 900 miles an hour just standing on a parking brake. You know, it's really hard. And over the years that I was writing this book, I was trying to navigate my own feelings of coming home, and learning a lot often from the veterans who I was working with. And so I chose characters who I thought might be good guides for readers for that experience as well. Who's next? Every platoon's got a guy just like you.
Thank goodness. What did you find out from asking those that you spoke with about their feelings about what they did? In other words, the morality of the situation
Okay, so
and
that's
the
fair.
sacrifice.
So I don't know how many people I know who were veterans of these wars. I mean, it's uncountable, some, and obviously I know some much better than others. The characters in the book purposefully represent a range of views about the wars and about their own actions. Just like any squad, there are people who have different feelings about what they did, individually, as a unit, all the way up to the national level. And without telling you which character there's one of them still believes the invasion of Iraq was justified. Another, I think, quite clearly believes we should not have invaded Iraq, and they would have been better, everyone involved, the troops, the Iraqis, both countries, governments, had we not done that. One is not disappointed, he's disgusted. Absolutely disgusted. And there's another who didn't think at that level. He had squads to run. Every day he ran his squads. He had Marines to bring home, and he didn't have the bandwidth, and maybe not also the inclination, to try to think through another level of the puzzle. He stayed at his level. I think these are fairly common frameworks among this big population, but what I did not do was select 6 sock puppets who sound like each other, either red state or blue state, like me, unlike me. I tried to present their views as those views inhabit their own heads. And they're a mix. And I'm not going to tell you that I'm sitting on any sort of formal survey data and can speak for the entire class. I won't do it. It's a mix. I think sorrow and disappointment run thick through this cohort of our citizens, but they're certainly not universally held feelings. Oh, I'm sorry. You're next. Yeah.
You talked a little bit about the disconnect between the broader public and these wars that was created by the end of universal conscription. I think all of us have watched the networks and a lot of our favorite newspapers stop staffing these conflicts. Could you talk a little bit about the state of war journalism in America now and how that impacts our ability to make good decisions about each of these conflicts?
How many hours you got? I mean, so before we would talk about the state of war journalism, we probably need to talk about the state of journalism, because in 2001 was a very different financial and market climate for newspapers and TV stations. That was pretty much pre-startup, right? The internet was around, but it had not done the damage to the business model, or if it had done it, people hadn't caught on to it yet. And so newspapers arrived at the wars. Journalists, the big journalist organizations arrived at the wars, heady with the energy of a nation that had been attacked, but also thick with cash. And so after several years, the business environment for journalism, particularly print journalism, had dramatically changed. And we saw big declines in staff reporting on the ground in these wars. Some of that was financial. some of it was also fatigue. You know, as we became more digital, and I mean, I'm not a click counter, and my peers will vouch for that. I haven't looked at the clicks on one of my stories. I wasn't taught how until this spring. And for about a week, I kind of looked at a few stories, and I haven't looked since. But I hear from the people who count the clicks that, you know, you write an informed, exclusive, interesting story about Syria, you get almost no traffic, right? I mean, newspapers, I think, should serve you your vegetables, so I don't really care about the traffic, but I know we have to care at some level. It can't be all vegetables. We have to have other stuff there to survive. But the war coverage is in part market-driven, and you, the market, I mean, not you personally, but you're here to talk or, you know, pay some respect to a war book or you wouldn't be in the room. But the larger public doesn't give a damn, right? I mean, we can see it in the data, you know, that the entertainment stories will get way more than attention than the stories about the wars. So the state of war journalism, I think, is pretty grim. It's also especially morally frightening because as we've cut back staffs, there still exists enough interest that many organizations are running war stories, and we run them with freelancers who might not have the experience or the safety net. I work for a legit employer. I have health care. I have retirement. I have mental health counseling, a phone call away if I want it. I have a support network of coworkers who have worked in all sorts of traumatic situations here in the United States and abroad. We really, at the New York Times, I think, have things in place to mostly look out for the well-being of our staff. A freelancer has almost none of that. Some have little more than a Facebook group or a drinking circle. And there's not much worse, in my view, for someone dealing with war than a drinking circle. Just about the worst thing you can have. And yet these are a number of the people who are providing a significant fraction of the war coverage. And they were a number of the people who were captured in Syria and passed, either captured by ISIS or passed off to ISIS, and who paid with their lives. I'd like to see different models. But remember, I'm the guy who covers the bottom, not the top, so I'm not going to tell you what the model is. At a minimum, you know, I salute people like Sebastian Junger, who, when he lost his friend, did more than grieve. He took steps to provide training to freelancers, basic first aid, life-saving steps training, and simple equipment that can add minutes to a life, because Tim died. I mean, I don't have a map in front of me, so don't hold me to the distance. I could, if I had the map, I could tell you exactly, but a few-minute drive from an Italian vascular surgeon who would have been able to put clamps on him, and perhaps, I'm not going to say would have saved his life, but we'll never know, because many of the people at the scene didn't have the life-saving steps or the life-saving skills to save him. And Sebastian's been working on that, and I think many of the employers now are being much more careful about giving assignments to people who are going to hop a fence, cross a border, and show up at a war and think they're going to dash back and write a story for $400. I can tell you that's not worth it. It's not a good model. And it's, in some ways, it's in my industry's betrayal on the good heart and good intentions of many people who want to cover real stories and do real things.
Hi. It's my feeling that there will be no significant change in what we've been doing unless there's significant pushback by the enlisted side of the mass of young people we've treated like this. And the officers that you're talking about who now lead our services have all grown up in the all-volunteer environment. They've never had to answer to communities in any significant way. It's my feeling that the only way that they would have to answer those kinds of questions. I mean, there's been no after actions. There's been no, just like in Vietnam, there's been no after action about how this happened, just from the military standpoint. You don't have to talk about the
So
political
can I take
side.
two things you said and answer back to you?
Yes, go ahead.
So the first thing you said is that, the enlisted have to push back. I'd argue with that. Insurrection's not the answer. It's not the military's rank and file's job to guide the military, at least not much above the patrol level. But that's our job.
I'm talking about the military. I'm talking about the enlisted veterans.
Oh, veterans. Okay, yes. The citizens,
yes.
absolutely. And
Exactly.
I look around, I see a number of veterans I know in the room who are trying to do exactly that, but they're small in number. The second thing I would do is agree with you on your other point about the leadership now has never had to answer for it. And I have a quip for that, which I will say is this: if we had a draft, it would not be enough for Jim Mattis to make Chuck Norris lines and call it a national strategy.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, you wouldn't get away with that if these wars were connected to what I say often, a mail lottery that determined who was going to have to go fight them. You're right. There is not, I call it uninformed consent.
Right. So do you feel that, I know you've outlined your objectives, but do you feel that the way you presented these young men, and I haven't gotten into your book yet, and I will, what has happened to them, do you think that is capable of supporting the organization to push back?
No.
No.
No, I'm very big about managing expectations every now and then I write something and there's some outcome that people would say objectively is good. I've been writing, most of my adult life. It's happened a handful of times. I don't sit here and trumpet that we're going to have any impact, that there will be much change.
Good.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, I'm a pessimist. Are we done? All right. This is the point of where you were in a platoon, you'd be stealing chow. Or fuel. Go ahead.
You made a comment about how some guys have the bandwidth to look at the big picture and some are just running their squad. Only a few chapters in, so maybe it's later on in the book. Is there anything, any thoughts, advice, comments, ramblings you'd want to give to some of those junior ranking officers who are there with them on how
That's
to
you? You're
manage
junior
themselves?
ranking? Yeah.
Not my current billet, but we'll see what happens next week in North Korea.
So it's often hard to know what's the right thing to do, but you usually know what's the wrong thing. That's sort of a baseline thing that it took me a long time in my life to figure out, like 50 years. Usually know what's the wrong thing to do. That's probably the thing to avoid. There's often a lot of pretty good options, and you won't know which one, whether it was going to work out till after you've tried it. That's just the nature of life around violence. I mean, the main thing I would say to any officer, young officer, is serve your ideals, not your commander, and listen to your NCOs. I mean, really listen to your NCOs. Sometimes the best thing you can say is nothing.
A later follow-up might be, did you get paid for your use of your likeness in Dogs of War?
No, that's a whole other story. No. I haven't seen the movie, but I've heard, I heard I'm in it. Yeah.
I have a question about the talk around the idea that we should privatize the war in Afghanistan. And I would like to hear what you think about that as a way of dealing with what seems to be an unwillingness to maybe walk away.
So I'm careful to talk about things I haven't really studied, so I can only give you a general answer without talking about the specifics that I know have been in the news for like the last couple of days, roughly. Anything that takes the wars, let me back up. Wars are a public act. When waged by our government with our uninformed consent and our money and our credibility and our blood as public acts, I think they should be publicly understood. Anything that removes them further from the public eyes, I think, is a grave risk that the wars will risk becoming more immoral and less effective. That's not to speak to the specifics of whatever's on the table at the moment, but I'm for more transparency, more discourse, more thoughtful, careful examination of any violent aspects organized under our foreign policy. And if we make it more private, we make it less visible. So I think I would show up, capital S, capital K, skeptical, capitals all the way across, and probably more than skeptical.
So I know war is a very terrible thing. I've seen sites that are unbelievable. What you describe is nothing in comparison. So let me just ask you a very simple question. Why did you join the Marines?
So Freud says all actions are over-motivated, right? I had a lot of reasons. I grew up on the edge of the Rust Belt in kind of a dumpy town and wanted to get out of town. And the Marine Corps was a way to do that. I was more than startled by the attack in 1983 on the Marine barracks and thought that there was a new war on, and I was curious about it, and I thought the only way to be curious is to get close and perhaps participate. I believed then, and I believe now, even though I consider myself a humanitarian, almost a pacifist, but not quite, because I believe this, and I'm going to look you in the eye when I say it. I think there's people in this world who do need to be shot. The problem with wars, I've come to learn, is we shoot the wrong ones the bulk of the time. So what I just said, I've come to learn, came to me later. I didn't know these things when I was 18 or 19 and decided to go.
So was it more like economics or peer pressure?
There was no peer pressure. There was the opposite. So I have Irish blood in me. My father was a Vietnam vet and pleaded with me not to join the Marine Corps. Made me want to go more.
I see. I was in Shuf in 83.
I didn't hear you?
Shuf Mountains, 83.
Yeah.
But this is nothing.
Yeah.
The main thing is the Yom Kippur War.
I didn't hear you.
The Yom Kippur War,
Yeah.
which is a most terrible thing. People are not just killed, but cooked, not killed. And you can't interview them. Nothing to interview.
Who's next? We're done, Brad?
So nothing's more humbling for a reporter to go back and do a book-length treatment on a beat that he or she's been covering for years. It's humbling because you realize how much deeper, how much maybe you missed in the pressures, particularly of daily journalism. So I wonder what you learned about your beat, about the military beat. I know you write about many other things as well, and how going forward. I assume you intend to continue to report on these wars, and so what will you be doing differently? How will the experience of writing the book now influence the kind of stories, or how you'll go about doing these stories?
So one of the many reasons I had for writing the book is I thought that it would be cathartic and might be a release for some of my anger. Just made me more angry. Didn't work. That's what I learned. I learned it was worse than I knew, bigger than I knew, uglier than I knew, had far more victims than I could count, that the rings of people around the immediately affected were far more extensive than I had even imagined. What I'll do differently, well, I don't know how much of that is related to the book. I'm at a phase in my career or my life where, those of you there's probably a few people here who used to read me pretty regularly because I was in the paper all the time. That's not me now. I work for the magazine. I've been involved in a number of long, slow developing projects. And that's what I'm going to keep doing. We have a number of them on the list that are in various stages of incubation. We have more that we're going to add soon, some working with other reporters, including 2 veterans who are in this room, some alone that I'll do. But I intend to keep doing sort of long form, deep dives, slow build journalism, and I've got to find some place to put this anger besides Twitter, right? So that's where it'll go.
Well, you want to sign some books?
Sure.
All right.